The morning started, like any other. Coffee brewing, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the faint hum of a world that hadn't yet gone wrong. I remember staring at the steam rising from my mug, feeling that quiet ache in my chest I couldn't quite name. For months, something had been shifting, slipping through my fingers like sand, but I kept pretending everything was fine. The laughter had faded first, then the small talks, the shared glances across the dinner table. Silence had moved in between us, heavy and uninvited. That day, though, I woke up different. Maybe it was the stillness in the air, or maybe I had finally stopped fighting what I already knew deep down. There's a kind of calm that comes before a storm, a strange, bittersweet peace when your heart realizes it's about to break, but is too tired to resist. I looked around the house, the framed memories on the walls, the scent of his cologne still lingering in the hallway, and for the first time I felt like a guest in my own life. It didn't happen overnight. The distance between them began like a hairline crack in glass, barely visible, easy to ignore, and easier still to excuse. At first, it was small things. He stopped reaching for her hand when they walked together. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now stalled mid-sentence, and dinners that used to be filled with laughter turned into quiet, mechanical exchanges. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just stress from work, that every marriage went through dull phases, but deep down, something in her chest started to tighten, a quiet whisper warning that this wasn't just a passing shadow. She began to notice how he no longer looked at her the same way. His eyes, once warm and full of familiarity, had grown distant, like he was looking past her instead of at her. He became distracted, always glued to his phone, typing messages he wouldn't explain. When she asked who he was talking to, he'd smile faintly and say, "Just work stuff," before tucking his phone away as though the screen held secrets she wasn't meant to see. The warmth that used to fill their home began to fade, replaced by a chill that lingered no matter how high she turned up the thermostat. She tried to bring them back together in small ways, suggesting weekend getaways, cooking his favorite meals, staying up late just to talk the way they used to. But he always had an excuse. Too tired, too busy, too distracted. The moments that used to define their closeness were slowly being replaced by an uncomfortable silence that said more than words ever could. Nights spent on opposite sides of the bed became the norm, their backs turned toward each other, both pretending to sleep while drowning in the ache of what they had lost. She began to second-guess herself. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe he just needed space. She replayed old memories in her head, like reruns of a show she couldn't bear to let go of. Their laughter in the kitchen, the way he used to kiss her forehead every morning, the small notes he'd leave on the counter that simply said, "Love you." Those gestures had vanished, and in their place was an unfamiliar version of him, a man who smiled without warmth and spoke without meaning it. Her friends noticed the change before she did. They'd ask, "Is everything okay between you two?" And she'd smile, the kind of practice smile that hides pain, and say, "Of course, just busy." She didn't want to admit that the foundation of her marriage was shifting beneath her feet. She clung to the belief that if she just tried harder, loved him a little more, things would go back to the way they were. But love alone couldn't fill the growing void between them. Everyday routines became strained. Breakfasts that once started with shared laughter now began in silence. He stopped waiting for her in the evenings, started eating alone, started coming home later and later. When he did come home, he smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. She wanted to ask, wanted to demand the truth, but fear held her tongue. Fear of hearing what she already suspected. Fear that saying it out loud would make it real. There were moments when she'd catch him lost in thought, staring off into space with a faint smile. Once, she asked what he was thinking about, and he shrugged, saying, "Nothing really." But the way his eyes softened told her everything she needed to know. He was thinking of someone else. That realization pierced her heart quietly, leaving her breathless. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. It was something worse. A slow, painful awareness that she was losing him piece by piece. The house that once felt like a haven began to suffocate her. She could feel his absence even when he was sitting right next to her. The sound of his footsteps no longer brought comfort, only a reminder that the man she loved was slipping away. She stopped trying to fix it after a while. Exhaustion replaced hope, and her efforts began to feel pointless. She could see it in his eyes every time she spoke. He had already left emotionally, even if his body still lingered under the same roof. What hurt the most wasn't the thought that he might love someone else. It was realizing how easily he had stopped loving her. There was no fight, no confrontation, no storm of emotions. Just a quiet fading, like a candle running out of wax. She wondered if he even noticed the change or if he had simply stopped caring altogether. She felt invisible in her own life, moving through days like a ghost haunting a home that no longer felt hers. The distance became its own kind of betrayal, one without words, without admissions, just silence heavy enough to crush her spirit. Every time he turned away, every time he chose his phone over her, every time he avoided her gaze, it chipped away at what little hope she had left. And though she tried to hold on, to pretend that things were still fixable, deep down she knew the truth. Love doesn't vanish overnight, but it can wither quietly when one heart stops trying. The truth came to her not in a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession, but in the quiet, almost cruel way that life sometimes reveals what you least want to see. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those days that feel too normal to ever carry the weight of change. She had gone to put away some laundry when she noticed his phone buzzing on the nightstand. Normally she never touched it. Trust had always been the invisible rule between them, the line she never crossed, but something inside her whispered to look, a feeling too strong to ignore. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, heart pounding like it already knew what it was about to find. There it was, her name, Claire. Just one message previewed on the screen, a simple heart emoji followed by words that shattered everything she thought she knew. I can't wait to see you tonight. For a moment her breath caught in her throat. Time seemed to freeze, and the world around her blurred into a hollow silence. She stared at the screen, reading and rereading the message, hoping somehow she was misunderstanding it. But the words didn't change. They stared back at her with cruel clarity, stripping away the comfort of denial she had been hiding behind for months. She scrolled, unable to stop herself, her fingers moving on their own. The messages told a story she didn't want to read. Late-night conversations, hidden plans, soft words that once belonged to her, now spoken to someone else. She saw her husband in those texts, but not the man she had married. This was a version of him she didn't recognize. Someone passionate, attentive, alive in a way he hadn't been with her in a long time. It was like watching a stranger wear his face. Her chest tightened, tears blurring her vision as the truth settled heavily in her heart. Claire wasn't just a name. Claire was the reason for the distance, the silence, the coldness. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone clutched in her hands, trying to breathe. Her mind spun through memories, moments that suddenly made sense in a new, devastating light. The late nights at the office, the sudden urge to work weekends, the unexplained smiles at his phone. Every excuse, every half-hearted reassurance, it all connected now in a perfect, painful puzzle. He hadn't been busy. He had been building a new world without her in it. For hours she stayed in that room, lost between rage and heartbreak. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to demand answers, but all she could do was sit there and feel the weight of betrayal pressing against her ribs. The woman she thought she was, the trusting wife, the patient partner, suddenly felt naive, foolish even. How long had she been living a lie? How many times had he looked her in the eyes while thinking of someone else? The betrayal wasn't just in the affair itself, it was in the deception, the quiet pretending, the way he had made her doubt her own instincts when she sensed something was wrong. That night, when he came home, she watched him closely. He smiled, greeted her casually, kissed her on the cheek as if nothing in the world had changed. She could almost taste the bitterness rising in her throat. She studied his face, looking for any flicker of guilt, but he carried himself with the same calm detachment that had become his new normal. It amazed her how easily he could lie without speaking. She said nothing at first, unsure if she was ready to hear him confirm what she already knew. But when he turned away, his phone buzzed again. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Something inside her broke then, a quiet snap that she felt in her bones. She asked him softly, "Who is Claire?" His body stiffened, the air thickening instantly between them. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, unbearable, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost rehearsed. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he said. Those words hit harder than she expected. There was no denial, no attempt to explain, just an admission that confirmed everything. She felt the tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. In that instant, something shifted inside her. Not just pain, but a strange cold clarity. The man she had built her life around, the one she had loved and trusted, was gone. He had already left her long before he said the words. The rest of the evening passed in fragments she could barely piece together. His excuses sounded hollow, his apologies mechanical. He spoke about confusion, about not meaning to hurt her, about finding something new with Claire, as if love were something replaceable, like a worn-out shirt you simply stop wearing. She listened in silence, too numb to argue. Her world was collapsing quietly around her, but her face remained calm. There was no more begging, no more hoping. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and there was no undoing that. When he finally walked out of the room, leaving her alone, she sat there in the heavy stillness, realizing that the life she thought she had was gone. The marriage she had fought to protect was already over, and the person she had trusted most had become the source of her deepest wound. The night after she learned the truth, she sat alone in the dark living room, her body trembling as if it was trying to shake off a reality too cruel to accept. The silence around her was unbearable, pressing in from every side. She could still hear his voice in her mind, calm and unapologetic, repeating those words that had splintered her world. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." It replayed over and over, each time cutting deeper, until she finally broke. The tears she had been holding back for hours spilled freely, uncontrollably. Every sob carried the weight of disappointment, betrayal, and grief for the life she had once cherished. She wept until her body gave out, until her throat was raw and her chest ached. In those moments she wasn't angry, just empty. She had spent so many years giving love, patience, forgiveness, only to be left with nothing but shattered trust. She questioned everything about herself. Was she not enough? Had she failed him somehow? Had her love been too much or too little? The endless loop of self-doubt clawed at her, pulling her deeper into the pit of heartbreak. The days that followed blurred together. She moved through them like a ghost, mechanically, silently, as though watching her own life from a distance. She went to work, made small talk, smiled when she had to, but the light in her eyes was gone. When she returned home, the walls seemed to whisper reminders of him, the jacket still hanging by the door, the half-empty coffee mug he'd left behind, the faint trace of his cologne that lingered on the couch. Every object in the house felt like a wound, proof of what used to be. But beneath all that pain, something unexpected began to stir. It started small, a faint flicker of realization, buried under layers of grief. She began to see the truth that had always been hiding behind the illusion of their marriage. She had spent years dimming herself to keep him comfortable, sacrificing her needs to protect his ego, shrinking her dreams to fit into the narrow space he allowed her to occupy. She had mistaken endurance for love, and silence for strength. Now, stripped of the illusion, she began to see her reflection clearly for the first time in years. Her breakdown wasn't just an ending, it was a reckoning. Every tear she shed washed away another layer of denial. The pain forced her to look at the person she had become, tired, invisible, and small. She realized she had spent so much time trying to hold the pieces of their relationship together that she had forgotten to hold on to herself. The betrayal that had shattered her also began to expose something powerful beneath the surface. A woman who had survived everything life had thrown at her, even this. One morning she looked at herself in the mirror and hardly recognized the face staring back. Her eyes were swollen, her expression weary, But beneath that exhaustion was something new: resolve. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just quiet determination. She didn't want to cry anymore. She didn't want to keep asking why or how he could do it. She wanted to stop waiting for answers that would never heal her. The realization came slowly but clearly. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could decide what came next. That spark of self-realization grew stronger with each passing day. She began to reclaim small pieces of herself, one at a time. She cleaned out the house, starting with his things. It wasn't easy. Every drawer she opened carried memories, every photo she touched brought tears. But she kept going. With every item she packed away, she felt lighter, freer. The home that had once been filled with tension and betrayal started to breathe again. She lit candles in the evenings, played her favorite music, and allowed herself to exist without guilt or apology. Slowly, she began to rediscover the things she loved. Painting, reading, walking at sunset, the simple joys that had once made her heart feel alive. For years, she had been too consumed by his needs, his moods, his approval. Now, for the first time, her life was hers alone. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but it began to feel less like emptiness and more like space. Space to grow, to heal, to find herself again. There were still nights when the sadness returned, sudden and overwhelming, catching her off guard. But even in those moments, she no longer felt broken. The tears that once came from despair now carried something different. A release, a quiet acceptance. She realized she didn't need to be rescued. Didn't need anyone to validate her worth. The heartbreak that had once consumed her had forced her to rebuild from the inside out, and in doing so, she found strength she didn't know she had. Her quiet breakdown had transformed into awakening. The pain had been necessary. It had burned away the illusions and left only truth behind. She had lost him, yes, but in that loss, she had uncovered something far more valuable. For the first time in years, she could feel her own heartbeat, steady and strong, reminding her that she was still here, still standing, and finally beginning to live for herself. In the weeks that followed, the fog of heartbreak began to lift. Not all at once, but slowly, like dawn breaking through after a long, sleepless night. The silence that once suffocated her began to feel different. It was no longer empty, it was peaceful. The same quiet house that had echoed with betrayal now became her sanctuary. A place where she could breathe without walking on eggshells, without worrying about who he was texting, or whether his smile was meant for someone else. It was strange at first, waking up to a life that was hers alone. The bed felt too big, the mornings too still, but underneath that discomfort was something unfamiliar and powerful: freedom. She started with small things. She changed the curtains, repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture. Every brushstroke, every new arrangement, felt like a declaration that she was reclaiming what had once been stolen from her peace. She cleaned out the closet, not just to remove his things, but to make space for herself again. The empty shelves didn't look sad anymore, they looked like possibility. Each act of letting go was an act of self-respect, each decision to move forward a quiet rebellion against the version of herself that had once settled for less than she deserved. For the first time in years she began to prioritize herself. She stopped apologizing for needing rest, stopped pretending to be okay when she wasn't. She let herself feel everything, the anger, the grief, the loneliness, but she didn't let any of it define her. She realized healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending she was fine. It was about choosing, every day, to rise again despite the pain. Some mornings she woke up with tears on her cheeks, but even then she got up, made her coffee, opened the curtains, and told herself that surviving was enough for today. There were moments when she stumbled, of course. Grief isn't linear, and neither is healing. Sometimes she missed him, not the man he had become, but the man she once believed he was. She missed the idea of love more than the person. But even in those moments of longing, she reminded herself why she had to let go. She remembered how small she had felt, how much of herself she had given away trying to keep him happy. how often she had silenced her own needs just to avoid conflict. She refused to go back to that version of herself. The heartbreak had stripped her bare, but it had also given her a chance to rebuild with strength, clarity, and self-worth. As days turned into weeks, her reflection in the mirror began to change. Her eyes, once dull from crying, started to shine again, not with naive hope but with quiet confidence. She smiled more easily now, not for anyone else's approval, but because she was proud of herself. She began to notice the beauty in ordinary things. The smell of rain, the warmth of sunlight through the window, the laughter that came naturally when she stopped pretending to be okay. She began to feel alive again. Friends started to notice the change in her. They told her she looked lighter, happier. She laughed at that, not because everything was perfect but because it was finally real. For years she had been performing happiness, masking her exhaustion behind forced smiles. Now, every smile came from a place of truth. She wasn't pretending anymore. She had finally accepted that strength wasn't about holding a relationship together at all costs. It was about knowing when to walk away and choosing yourself instead. She began exploring parts of her life she had put on hold for too long. She took a weekend trip alone, something she had always wanted to do but never dared to. She went to the beach, let the wind tangle her hair, and watched the waves crash endlessly against the shore. It felt symbolic somehow, each wave rising, breaking, then beginning again. That's what she was doing too. She was beginning again. The loneliness she had feared so much started to feel like independence. The quiet evenings became moments of reflection rather than reminders of what she had lost. Every small victory, fixing something around the house, making a decision without hesitation, laughing without guilt, became proof of how far she had come. She no longer defined herself as someone who was left behind. She was someone who had survived. Someone who was learning to live boldly again. She realized she didn't need to be rescued or completed by anyone. She had everything she needed within herself. The woman she was becoming was nothing like the one who had cried on the living room floor weeks earlier. That woman had been broken, yes, but she had also been brave enough to face the truth. Now, she stood taller, spoke with certainty, and carried herself with quiet power. She no longer feared being alone. She feared ever losing herself again. What had once been the story of betrayal was slowly transforming into a story of rediscovery. Every wound, every scar, was now a reminder of her strength. Proof that she had endured and found herself in the ashes of what was once her life. Starting over wasn't easy, but it was liberating in a way she hadn't expected. The world that once felt like it had collapsed around her was slowly opening up again, offering her space to breathe, to rebuild, and to redefine what her life meant. For the first time in years, every decision was hers alone. What to eat for dinner, where to go, how to spend her weekends. She didn't have to check in with anyone or measure her choices against someone else's moods. That freedom was unfamiliar at first, even frightening. But it began to feel like sunlight breaking through a storm after too many dark days. She wasn't living to please anyone anymore. She was living for herself. She began to focus on her career, throwing herself into projects she had once put aside. For so long she had lived in the shadow of his ambitions, always supporting, always waiting for her turn. Now, her turn had come. She started staying late at work. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She rediscovered her own competence, her own talent, her own drive. Each small success built her confidence back piece by piece, and with every compliment from her colleagues or recognition from her boss, she felt something inside her heal. She no longer needed validation from a man who couldn't see her worth. She was proving it to herself with every step forward. Outside of work, she began reconnecting with people she had lost touch with. Friends she had drifted from because her marriage had consumed so much of her energy. They welcomed her back with open arms, and for the first time she realized how much she had isolated herself to keep the illusion of her relationship intact. Those coffee dates, late-night talks, and spontaneous outings reminded her that love existed in many forms, not just the romantic kind, but in laughter, shared memories, and genuine connection. She began to fill her life with people who lifted her up instead of draining her. She also started taking care of herself in ways she had long neglected. She joined a yoga class, went for long walks in the evenings, and learned to cook meals just for herself. At first, it felt strange setting the table for one, but soon it became a ritual of self-respect. She lit candles, played music, and made dinner an act of self-love instead of loneliness. The small routines she built became anchors in her new life, reminders that peace could exist in simplicity. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Some nights she'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had ended up here, alone after giving so much of herself to someone who didn't stay. But then she'd remind herself that being alone was far better than being unseen. The loneliness wasn't emptiness anymore. It was space for growth. It was proof that she had survived something meant to break her, and was still standing strong. The more she embraced her independence, the more she realized how much of her identity had been shaped around him. Every decision, every plan, had once revolved around his preferences, his comfort, his future. Now, she was free to imagine her own future, and it was bigger than she had ever allowed herself to dream. She started writing again, a passion she had buried years ago. Words became her therapy, a way to make sense of her pain and transform it into purpose. Her journal filled with reflections, goals, and affirmations. Slowly, her story stopped being about what she had lost and started being about what she was creating as the months passed. She noticed a quiet confidence growing within her. She spoke differently, walked differently, carried herself with a calm assurance that came from knowing her worth. The people around her noticed it too. When they told her she looked happy, she smiled, not the kind of forced smile she used to wear, but a genuine one that reached her eyes. Happiness no longer depended on someone else's presence, it came from within. She started setting boundaries, something she had never been good at before. She learned to say no without guilt, to protect her peace, to distance herself from anything that threatened her healing. That included him. When he tried to reach out, once, twice, testing if the door was still open, she didn't respond. She no longer needed closure, no longer needed apologies that would only reopen old wounds. Her silence was her answer, her power. She realized that independence wasn't about shutting people out, it was about knowing she could stand alone if she had to. She had built a life that didn't depend on anyone else to validate it. She had found strength in solitude, beauty in simplicity, and pride in her own resilience. Her past no longer defined her. It had shaped her, yes, but it no longer controlled her. With every passing day she became more grounded, more at peace with who she was becoming. The woman who once begged for love now radiated self-respect. The one who once feared being alone now cherished her solitude. She had turned her pain into power, her heartbreak into growth, and her loneliness into freedom. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and this time she wasn't building for someone else, she was building for herself. Peace came to her quietly, without fanfare or grand revelation. It wasn't sudden but gradual, like a tide returning to shore after a storm. There were no more sleepless nights spent replaying his words, no more wondering what she could have done differently. The questions that once haunted her had lost their power. She had cried enough tears, spoken enough to the empty air, and finally learned to let silence be her closure. It wasn't forgiveness she sought anymore. It was freedom from carrying what no longer belonged to her. She began to see the past for what it was. A chapter, not a sentence. It shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her future. Each morning felt a little lighter than the one before. She would wake up to sunlight streaming through her window and feel gratitude instead of grief. The bed that once felt too big now felt just right. The quiet in her home no longer felt like loneliness. It was peace, the kind that came from being comfortable in her own company. She stopped checking her phone for messages that would never come, and stopped replaying the last conversation in her head. Her heart no longer raced when she heard his name. The wounds that had once felt raw had turned into scars, faint reminders of pain that no longer ruled her. In that stillness she began to notice the beauty of her own presence. There was something powerful about being able to sit alone in a cafe, sip her coffee and feel complete. She no longer needed to fill every silence with noise or every absence with someone new. Her contentment was self-made. She had built it from the ruins of what once broke her. She laughed more easily now, not because life was perfect, but because she had finally stopped waiting for it to be. She had found peace not in the absence of pain, but in accepting that pain was part of her story, and that she had survived it. There were moments when she'd look back on the woman she used to be. The one who stayed too long, who forgave too easily, who doubted her own worth, and feel both sorrow and pride. Sorrow for the pain she endured, pride for the strength it took to walk away. That version of her had been fragile, but she had also been brave. Every heartbreak, every sleepless night had led her here, to this calm, grounded version of herself. She no longer wished to erase the past. She could see now that even the worst moments had carried lessons. They had taught her resilience, patience, and most importantly, self-love. As she moved through her days, she started noticing how much she had grown. Things that used to upset her no longer had the same effect. She didn't chase explanations or demand closure. When people disappointed her, she didn't break. She simply let them go. It was a quiet kind of strength. The kind that comes from understanding that peace isn't something you find in others, it's something you cultivate within yourself. She began to trust herself again, to listen to that inner voice she had once silenced for the sake of keeping someone else happy. That trust became her compass. Her world expanded in ways she hadn't imagined. She began traveling, even if it was just weekend road trips to places she'd never been. She met new people, shared stories, and found comfort in knowing that everyone carried their own kind of brokenness. Connection became simpler, more genuine. She no longer sought perfection or promises, only authenticity. Her heart was open, but no longer desperate. She had learned that love wasn't about losing yourself to keep someone else. It was about standing beside someone while remaining whole. One evening, she sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything she had endured. The betrayal that once seemed unbearable had been the catalyst for her awakening. It had forced her to confront herself, to rebuild, to rediscover the strength she never knew she possessed. She realized she didn't just survive what happened, she had transformed because of it. Peace, she learned, wasn't loud. It didn't come with grand gestures or sudden realizations. It was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. It lived in the small things, in making her bed each morning, in cooking her favorite meal, in laughing without hesitation, in knowing that her worth had never depended on anyone else's love. The freedom she found wasn't about being alone, it was about being complete within herself. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her happiness no longer needed to be validated or explained. It simply was, and though her journey had been marked by heartbreak, she had turned that pain into wisdom. She understood now that sometimes losing someone isn't the tragedy, it's the release. She hadn't lost a husband. She had lost the version of herself that accepted less than she deserved. In its place, she found clarity, peace, and an unshakable sense of self. She no longer feared the future, because she knew whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the darkest nights. In the end, her story wasn't one of loss, it was one of rediscovery. What began as heartbreak became a journey toward freedom, self-respect, and peace. She learned that sometimes the ending you fear most is the beginning you truly need. The love she once searched for in someone else, she found within herself. The betrayal that shattered her also rebuilt her into someone wiser, stronger, and unshakably grounded. No longer defined by pain or dependence, she became the author of her own life. No longer waiting for validation, no longer afraid to stand alone. She realized that true healing isn't about forgetting the past, but embracing the lessons it gave. Her husband's departure wasn't her undoing, it was her liberation. In losing him, she found herself, and in finding herself, she discovered the peace that comes only when a woman finally chooses her own freedom.